In November of 1994, Sega would release the 32X, a system upgrade to their successful Genesis platform. This upgrade promised 32-bit software at an affordable price. As most of you know, this platform would be a disaster to both the company's image and to the thousands of dedicated fans that purchased it at launch. There were only about 40 games released for it in its entire run, and Sega and its third parties abandoned it after little more than a year on the market. There certainly is no shortage of bad things to read and listen to about the 32X on the internet these days. But was the 32X totally useless to the people that actually owned it while it was on the market? Did any of the games actually warrant praise? I purchased the North American 32X right around its launch and supported it its entire life. And you're going to get my views on whether its game library was any good and how it felt to actually own the 32X during its run. I hope you guys enjoy the Sega 32X experience. The launch of the 32X in North America was actually a really exciting time. The Saturn and PlayStation were still nearly a year away at this time, and the 32-bit systems already on the market like the 3DO and Jaguar had failed to set the world on fire either due to high pricing, lack of games, or both. Sega was promising 32-bit quality gaming at a price many of us could afford, and it was the hot topic among my friends that played games, whether they were Sega fans or not. With some of my favorites like Castlevania and Capcom's Aliens vs Predator in development, the 32X was looking like a surefire hit. When the system finally landed, I couldn't have been happier. This was my first time owning Doom, the classic first-person shooter that was crazy popular on the PC. Since this was my first time with the game, the 32X did a bang-up job on the port, giving you a decent frame rate and detail on a device that was significantly less than any PC at the time. It's pretty easy to trash this version in hindsight today, but in November of 1994, Doom on the 32X was a great and affordable way to be introduced to the game. Doom wasn't the only game early on in the system's life that wowed me either, because its version of the Model 1 arcade classic Virtua Racing, titled Virtua Racing Deluxe, was a hell of a ride too. Much improved over the Genesis version of the game, this here just blew me away. I loved the multiple viewpoints, and while the frame rate was significantly pared back from the arcade, it still played well. I could stare at the replay feature for hours, admiring the flat shaded polygons that looked so stunning back then. It also had a number of exclusive tracks, a rare addition to Sega arcade ports at the time. This wasn't the only Model 1 arcade port the 32X would get early on, as they also had Star Wars Arcade available. This game was one of the hardest games I've ever played. Anything less than nearly perfect gameplay would see you looking at the continue screen constantly. It was a good looking game though, and I spent quite a bit of time trying to beat it. Real-time polygonal Star Wars games were not a dime a dozen at that point, so it certainly had its appeal. Polygons wouldn't be the only thing the 32X would bring to the table, as a couple of early 1995 releases would show. Space Harrier was a port of the Superscaler classic that was originally released in the arcades in 1985, and boy was it a solid representation of its source material. Finally, a home console version had done it justice, with great sprite scaling and even a solid soundtrack backing it up. It reignited my love of the game, and I spent many evenings reliving one of Yu Suzuki's great early titles. Afterburner 2 would get a 32X release as well, this time called Afterburner Complete. Much like Space Harrier, it did a bang-up job recreating the arcade experience, once again with some solid sprite scaling and an even better soundtrack backing it up. Both these games landed on top of one another, giving the 32X a fantastic start as a 32-bit add-on. Despite that strong start, not everything was perfect however, even in those early days. The 32X itself was sold for a reasonable price of about $160 in North America, but software was really expensive. Some games were $10 to $20 more than a full retail Genesis title, meaning you were paying $60 to $70 for each game. Sega also had a number of early duds that didn't do the system any justice at all. Garbage like the 2D fighting game Cosmic Carnage, the 3D mech shooter Metalhead, and the atrocious Motocross Championship would have been poor efforts on older hardware, much less the brand spanking new 32X. cracks really began to show in the 32X strategy when third-party software started to arrive. Not only were these releases few and far between, but they were sometimes even more expensive, and sometimes little more than slightly upgraded versions of their Genesis counterparts. Luckily, some of these releases held up on the 32X and kept hope alive that it would succeed. Acclaim in particular got out some releases that were solid on the 32X. NBA Jam Tournament Edition was one of the better arcade ports of that game. WWF Raw was pretty good, and the port of Mortal Kombat 2 stands as perhaps the best home version of that game from the time period. Other third-party standouts were Blackthorne, an adventure game that originated from a PC game developed by Blizzard. I have a particular fondness for this one, thanks to its puzzle and exploration elements that made it far more than your traditional action title. It looked incredibly good too, with a vast color palette and silky smooth animation. Sega themselves would also keep churning out games for the 32X during 1995. Knuckles Chaotix would be their answer to a Sonic game for the platform. The gameplay in this was weird, relying on a rubber banding mechanic where two characters were always tied together, playing off each other's momentum. It was a good-looking platformer that took some getting used to, but wasn't a bad game at all, and certainly looked the part with its great color use and many layers of parallax scrolling. Sega would also get out a pair of polygon shooters. Zaxxon's Mother Base 2000 was an isometric shoot-'em-up where you could take control of your enemies, and Shadow Squadron was a free-roaming space combat shooter that used flat-shaded polygons. Neither one of these games were particularly excellent in any category, with short development times no doubt contributing to their lack of wow factor and quality. The 32X also got some CD-based games that could be used if you had a Sega CD attachment. This was particularly exciting to me, as I had felt the cartridge format was going to hold back elements of 32X development, something the vast storage of CDs could offset. Unfortunately, my hopes were utterly crushed as the only games being talked about were full motion video based, and worse, ports of games we already had gotten on the Sega CD. Sega didn't even attempt to expand any traditional game designs with the 32X CD combo. Hell, I would have taken an enhanced port of Streets of Rage 3 with an expanded color palette and a rocking Yuzo Koshiro CD soundtrack over more full motion video games. If Sega wanted to rehash something, it could have been something Sega fans had actually wanted. With both the Saturn and PlayStation finally on the North American market by the second half of 1995, real problems began to show for the platform. You stopped hearing about new game announcements, and games supposedly in development dropped off the face of the planet. You stopped hearing about much of anything from game magazines, and new game releases slowed from a crawl to a snail's pace. Right around this time, Sega released Virtua Fighter for the 32X, in what seemed like a last-ditch effort to bring some real attention to the platform. They even packed it in with new 32X systems, which had already started seeing big price drops. This failed to do anything more than to get a positive mention in the game magazines that still covered 32X games. It was a damn shame too, because this version of the game is surprisingly good, showing that the 32X may indeed have been capable of providing a budget 32-bit experience to those not quite ready for the more expensive alternatives. In effect, Sega had squandered its chance to make its customers care about the 32X, and all eyes were on the Saturn and PlayStation. The final nail came as 1995 closed and 1996 came into view. Big games that had been announced began to be cancelled. Even Sega went quiet on just about anything related to the 32X. Then came the announcement that Sega would stop supporting it, and Spider-Man Web of Fire would be its last game released in North America. Even though I had owned a Saturn the entire time I had supported the 32X, this was an incredible betrayal. I had never felt duped by Sega before this. Even their Sega CD platform had seen 3 years of support and over 200 games released, but here we got less than a quarter of the games and barely more than a year of support. Sega wasn't done kicking its fans square in the balls though, as the aforementioned Spider-Man Web of Fire was a $70 atrocity of game design. Instead of thanking its fans with something truly impressive, we all were fleeced one last time. Ultimately, the 32X story is all about timing. The fundamental core of the 32X idea was a good one. Release a powerful add-on to millions of people who had already bought your original console, and charge half the price of the alternatives. Of course, By releasing the 32X right on top of the Saturn, Sega split its resources across two platforms and essentially competed with itself. This also created a problem for their third parties, who were faced with a similar position of supporting two competing Sega platforms. Had the 32X experiment come a year sooner, with a full arsenal of Sega's IPs, things could have been a little better. It was never going to supplant the PlayStation or Nintendo 64, but it could have sold enough to offset some of Sega's investment. History is 100% correct in lambasting the 32X. Just about everything about it was a disaster, and even if I could argue that roughly half its game library is worth playing, that amounts to only about 20 games, a paltry sum for the promises Sega made back in 1994. I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that had Sega poured all the money and resources it wasted on the 32X into the Saturn, things may have been a little better for them in the long run. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.
Machine has appeared in homes across America.
Double and redouble his power. 32.
6 times more powerful than 3DO.
Alright, baby.
40 times more than Super NES.
Hey, yo, there is no 32-bit Super NES. Are we gonna see the games or what? Show me!
Increase the power of the unit 40 times.
Thank you.
Sega.